Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stephanie Michelle, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode. Hi, Sarah, and hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, we're talking about, but I can't cope with my weight gain, either weight gain in recovery from dieting as we move towards intuitive eating or recovery from binge eating. I think this is a topic that we can all relate to. Weight gain is probably the hardest part about giving up dieting and or struggling with an eating disorder, certainly one of the harder things. So hopefully we'll hit on something for everyone today. And Sarah, I guess I'll start with you. How was your experience both during your eating disorder and during your binge eating, or as you recovered? Did you experience weight gain then? And how were you dealing with that? How were you able to wrap your head around that in the moment of that experience?
Weight gain used to always make me really panic. I can remember when I was in a cycle of binging and my weight would be going up, that fear every day that would be with me. And also the idea you don't know when it's going to stop because you feel so out of control. And I genuinely thought when my binge eating started, I could genuinely envisage myself being like housebound because I felt like this was just going to go on. I didn't have an end in sight. I think for me, because I wasn't doing much actual restriction, that for me, in my situation, recovery didn't involve gaining weight because I hadn't restricted physically much. My restriction was much more mental and my relationship with food much more emotional. So I haven't had that experience of having to let go and allow the weight gain to come or not, because that just wasn't where I was at when I started doing my recovery. But I'm guessing that your experience was going to be quite different to that, because I know for you did the whole all in. I need to stop restricting. I need to stop dieting and allow myself to eat what I want. So I think you kind of talked about it a bit before. You had more of that out of control eating in the recovery stage, where actually my eating was more out of control when I wasn't in the recovery stage.
Yeah, I can actually relate to both because I've mentioned before, but I've had so many different phases of being in a dieting mindset and having binge eating active in my life day to day, and the restrict binge cycle as well. So my entire purpose was avoiding that feeling of gaining weight. So when I was more in my college years and in my 20s, I was pretty much just binging and just having the mental restriction that was the most active. It wasn't so much physical restriction. And I watched my body grow and then sometimes I would get it quote unquote under control, but I would watch my body grow sort of steadily, and panic was, I mean, there was always this associated panic with that. And I do think there's something about the process of it not being stable. And I associate this with that general feeling of not being stable. That feels really threatening. That feels like, where do I begin and end? When does this stop? Will it stop? I feel like if I let it go a little is a lot, because it's all or nothing. That's the mindset in general. And I think I lived that way too. So having that sense of feeling like I cannot get to a place where I get out of control was always the goal. So I did later adopt the restrict binge as a way of countering that out of control feeling, because if I binged and I had that panicky sense of, oh no, I'm getting out of control, that's the direction I'm heading in, I would restrict to make myself feel better. It was like, okay, well, now I've counteracted. Now I'm doing that. So I did later have sort of like a weight management system that happened out of binging, restricting. And when I went into the actual recovery process, it was like you're taking away the restriction days. So I no longer had the counterbalance, and it was a willing, like my eyes were wide open in that, where it was like, this is going to happen. You're going to be gaining weight. And for me, having my eyes open about it was a difference between the earlier stages and the recovery process stages, because I think there's something about knowing it and expecting it, and that somehow puts it a little bit more in your control, because you're saying I'm doing this on purpose, versus before when it was like, I'm not doing this on purpose. This is something I have no handle on. I have no say so. Um, Still, there was a lot of panic. And I think that's the exact word, because the second you perceive that your body is shifting, it's not just that your body is changing. It's not even just that the weight has been gained. It's that, uh-oh, like, is this going to ever stop? I feel like it's headed on a trajectory of it being out of control. And I've spoken to clients who have said, if I knew my weight would stop here, I could accept my body, but I don't know that it will ever end. And it's interesting to watch, like, that someone could wrap their head around being in the body, but the same body size feels unacceptable if we don't know that it's going to not get out of control. And I think that that's such a metaphor for something larger, that feeling of out of controlness, that we feel like if we begin something, we just don't know how to stop. And how much that relates to our body, but how much it relates to our life or our emotions. And that's the sense of feeling like we're on some kind of path that never ends.
Mhm. And that different reaction to certain weights, depending on whether you're going up and down the scale. So a weight that perhaps you don't like because it's too higher than you want it to be, if you're going upwards and you hit that weight, that panic and terror, that's very different to if you're coming down because you're in a restriction mode or something. So there's this story and this anticipation about what's happening next that I think is so frightening. And people will want to know, well, am I going to gain weight? That's the question. Am I going to gain weight? And it's always going to be, for me, it's always going to be, I don't know, because I don't know if somebody's going to gain weight in recovery or not. Where most people are is that they already think that their body's too big. They already are not happy with their weight. So the thought of their weight getting higher, the mind thinks like that, I can't cope with that. That is an impossibility to be okay higher than I am when I'm not feeling okay with where I am now. And this, I suppose, it comes around to this control, but it also comes around to like this judgment and this world that we live in. We're at a stage, so we're recording this kind of after like a year and a half of lockdowns for most of the world. And a lot of people have found their routines had changed, and people that don't really struggle with disordered eating have gained weight. So there's a lot of talk, certainly over here in the UK, about weight loss, about body size. So it's everywhere at the moment. This value put on it is so high. So it feels like if we're going in the opposite direction to what society's values are. I mean, I don't know what that does to, like, I say I don't know what
Mm.
that does. I kind of do. I've been there. But what it does to like how we think about ourselves and whether we're doing what we're supposed to be doing and whether we're okay human beings, right?
Yeah, well, you're right. It's more the mind over than the physical state of that and the anticipation of something, because we're taught, and I really believed that weighing more than wherever I was equals um, a lot of different adjectives: laziness, out of controlness, just that sense of condescension coming from everywhere, that you've gained weight, you're doing something bad and wrong and unhealthy. There's that association of that's built into weight gain. And so we project and we predict that when if we gain weight and our body gets bigger, that we will land in a puddle of that. Like, that's where we'll be. And oh no, we're not there yet, but we're gonna be. And that's terrifying. And that is a different experience than actually getting there and realizing that you're surviving and nothing really changed. For me, it was that, especially in my actual recovery process following the binge restrict, where I was actively gaining weight, fearing it, watching myself fear it in predictive mode, then arriving, my jeans are too tight today, or actually I wasn't wearing jeans. I was wearing yoga pants the whole time. That I was outgrowing these things and kind of having this sense of, oh my gosh, it's happened. Here I am in this place that I have imagined to be the worst place in the world. And yet I'm still moving around. I'm still doing things. And to be fair, sometimes that's not happening for people, where it's a very paralyzing experience. I did find the moments where, I was still me and I was still living my life. And yes, my pants were tighter and I felt really badly about that. And it did affect my mood. But it didn't shift me into this vision I'd had of what it meant to be that. Like, it would all of a sudden change everything about me and my life experience. That didn't happen. And when it didn't happen, there's something about that fear facing in that moment where you're kind of like, I'm here. I'm here in that place that I thought was so terrible. And not fun, but it's not that terrible. I'm not what society told me I would be, you know? And even if there is that objective judgment, there's not that lived experience of feeling like something drastic has changed. And that is hopeful. I think that for me always was an interesting thing of feeling like it's harder to sit in the projection than it is to actually experience the thing. Um, so that's always to me been a really interesting, and I still think about it when I imagine, like, if my pants do still get tighter, right? And it's kind of like, I've been here before. I know that this is something I can do. Like, because the world will have you believe that this is the worst thing that could ever happen. And it's just like so, and it says so much about you. And then you do that and you're like, No, it doesn't. I mean, like, this is not pleasant, but it's not what you said it would be.
Yeah. And when you talked about lived experience, what it made me think about was actually we're talking to a really wide range of experiences here. And, I don't know the specific details of like how much your weight changed, but so I've had that experience of my weight changing very quickly in a short space of time, going up several dress sizes, doing a double take when you look in the mirror, none of your clothes fitting within the space of a few months. That said, I have not had the experience of living in a body where navigating the world is difficult at a practical. So we talk about straight size bodies and non-straight size bodies. I've always been able to sit as comfortably as one can in an airplane seat, as an example. And I've never had anybody shout abuse at me in the street.
Mhm.
I've had medical people tell me to lose weight. I've had one or two kind of comments about my body being too big, but that's probably the extent in terms of how the external world has treated me. And like, we can't separate ourselves from our environment. So how we then become treated because of weight gain by people close to us, by the world at large, depending on like what the variations are, I think is just worth a mention and an acknowledgement, because there are different things to contend with in that situation that you and we try to speak in a way that hopefully resonates with people, but we're not going to be able to be that resonant with people whose experience we haven't had.
Yeah. That to me is like in even just thinking about this podcast and preparing for it. The difference between I can't cope with my weight gain being I can't cope with it feels to me more like that personal experience of not being able to cope. I see that as different. We've talked about this before. That is different than the onus being out there and that society refuses to allow you to cope with it. The personal versus the social experience of weight gain, and that we have some say over our personal experience. And I think there's a lot of mental work you can do to work through some of the thoughts you have about your own personal body. We really ingest what society tells us about ourselves and we assume it as our own personal responsibility. And I think it's worth separating what is the personal experience and judgment you're putting on yourself based on your stories and your history versus the projections that society has put on you, and separating the responsibility, because the onus shouldn't be on you as a person, and the shame shouldn't be on you as a person when it's coming from a social standard that is discriminatory and that there's so much stigma involved there. That's something to place the responsibility outside and point the finger there instead of allowing yourself to point the finger at yourself. And I think these are two distinct pieces of work, because one you can kind of control and one you can't. And again, yes, this is a very real experience. When we're talking about coping with the weight gain, there's a difference, I think, between this personal coping and having to deal with now something you can't control at all. You can't manipulate the way that society paints the picture of a larger body.
The way I see it, if you've gained weight and you really hate your weight gain and you're feeling really uncomfortable in your body, it feels like there's two options. It feels like there's option number one is to lose weight. And there's option number two, which is about trying to figure out how to live a life in a body that you're not feeling very comfortable in right now. Option number one, every time I went for option number one, because that was the one I wanted, my binge eating got worse and it had the opposite effect. And I stayed in the panic and I kept gaining. When people say to me, how do you let go? How did you let go of the desire to lose weight? I've said this before. The only reason I did was because it was just too damaging to keep trying. It was having the opposite effect. And I had to surrender to that, because I think what often happens is we just want to believe that there's something we're missing in this weight loss game, that we can do it, because we'll find evidence somewhere of someone who's done it. And we're like, if that person can do it, I should be able to do it. So I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep trying at this. And then the years go by, years. And for people, decades go by. And they're still trying to do this thing that is eluding them. But because some people seem to be able to do it, it's really hard to let go of this idea that this must be possible for me some way. It must be possible. And that, I think, what happened with me is my experience with food and my eating disorder, like, it humbled me. I could have carried on fighting and going like, no, I can do this. And I had to go, no, I can't do this. And get to a place where that doesn't mean something shameful about me. I just can't do it. Whenever I try, it doesn't work. Whenever I try, something goes in my brain. So sometimes people will say to me, when's the last time you binged? That's hard for me to say, because I would say that even since I see myself as recovered, I have binged. And each time it's been because part of me's thought, I've been pretty balanced with food for a while, so maybe now's the time to try and get myself into the acceptable BMI range, because that's what my mind will tell me. And each time I go there, it comes back. And when it comes back, I go, oh, shit. Are we allowed to swear on this podcast? I think this might be the first swear word we've had on the podcast. And it was me.
Go for it, Sarah.
What will my family say? And I've even lost my train of thought after that, because I got so distracted by my own potty mouth. But I was on a bit of a roll there. That belief, because I can still go back there even now. And maybe one day that won't be the case. But each time I just have to take a humility pill. Yeah. And I don't like swallowing it.
No. Oh, we could have a whole episode on humility. I was thinking as you're talking about the two very different places people might be listening from. Coping with weight gain while you're sitting in a binge place, or emotional eating, overeating, where we know that the weight is coming from this overconsumption because we haven't stopped binging yet, versus coping with weight gain that might be a natural byproduct of recovery because your body is reaching its natural set point. Like maybe it's weight that needed to be gained because our bodies just were suppressed calorically, or just want to be bigger than we want them to be. And having been in both of these shoes, I think there's a difference. So I think this coping with weight gain that feels like it's not yours, right? Like I remember, again, college 20s, my weight was sitting above where my natural weight point seems to really be. At the time, I had no way of knowing that, but I think there was a part of me that perceived that. And I think this is also because I was chronically binging and not restricting. I was only mentally restricting. So I was eating more regularly than my body needed. I was constantly full to the brim. And I think that kind of weight gain, coping with that, ultimately, we still need the same factors of acceptance and not resisting it and having compassion, right? But I think that there's a difference in kind of like that there's this perception inside somewhere, and like a knowing that your body isn't where it wants to be. And it perceives that and it knows that. And coping with that is really hard, because it's also coping with the fact that you can watch yourself and feel yourself overfilling all the time, and that you know that you're not aligned yet. I think it's part of that feeling too, because I remember feeling like if my eating was regulated and I was in this same body, I think it would feel better. I think I would have more of a chance of coming to terms with it. But it was the way that we enmeshed these things together, like the excess weight in combination with the out of control eating was too much for me to sit and accept. I was very opposed to the whole thing because I knew that it was a product of my dysregulation in general. Like the weight was sort of just a symbol of that. And coping with that was really difficult for me because I knew that something wasn't right. Whereas later, when I was coping with my body actually gaining weight to recover because I had been a bit weight suppressed. And by the way, when I say weight suppressed, I do not mean underweight or like low BMI because I wasn't. It was just weight suppressed for me. My natural body weight range is not that of a very thin person. I'm upper end of straight size. That's where I sit. And I was just kind of hanging out just slightly below that for a long time from restriction, but nobody would have ever called me weight suppressed, just based on, just to get that out there, because you don't have to be very thin to be weight suppressed. So the weight gain that I experienced from that point was more like me coming to terms with the fact that my weight set range wasn't what I wanted it to be. It wasn't that I was over where my body wanted to be. It wasn't that sort of malalignment. It was more, I have to give up this ideal that I've had and this identity that I have built around being a thinner person than I actually am. That was a grief process, that was an angry process, but ultimately it was something that was more naturally me, and that was a different coping skill, I think, than perceiving that I wasn't where my body wanted to be. You know if you're following what I'm saying here? Am I making any sense?
You're making so much sense.
Okay.
So the word I often use, and I'm slightly reluctant to use it here because it's going to sound moralistic, and being moralistic around food is not helpful. But there was something for me around eating with integrity. And what I mean by that is just kind of eating in alignment with my values, wanting to look after myself and wanting to enjoy food and wanting to feel free around food. But that's very different from when you are using food to numb emotions or you're having this very reactive eating. So in those situations, my weight went up a bit. Like it felt okay because I was eating kind of in alignment with how I wanted to show up in the world. It wasn't about what I ate. It was more just about how I ate, how I felt about food, how I was talking to myself about food, the energy and motivation behind my decisions around food. When all of that felt like it was where I wanted it to be, then changes in weight were much less distressing compared to that out of control, frantic, almost kind of self-harming way of eating where it's just tearing you down. It seems to be just a self-destruct button. And I think that's sounded like what you were saying in a slightly different way.
Yeah, that was definitely part of it. And there's different ways of coping with this. And I think as far as the first way where you're eating without integrity, and maybe I'll ask, we can have this conversation. Considering that there's these two ways of feeling like you can't cope with your weight gain, how would you address somebody who's in the position of trying to cope with weight gain that feels quote unquote wrong, that feels like it's coming from a place of not living in alignment with your values and of being truly feeling like you're still out of control and the weight gain is a product of that? How do you cope with knowing that?
I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for today's episode. So thank you, Stef.
And thank you, Sarah.
We are sponsoring our own podcast because this is our job. And if you want to connect with any of us or work with either of us, you can connect with me, Sarah. I'm the bingeeatingtherapist.com. That's my website. I am Binge Eating Therapist on Instagram, and I do have a YouTube channel as well called The Binge Eating Therapist. So come and connect with me over there. Steph?
And if you'd like to work with me, I am Stephanie Michelle on Instagram and Facebook, and my website is iamstephaniemichelle.com. And I'm currently running a 12-week course for anyone looking to heal their relationship with food, coming out of binge eating and emotional eating, and moving towards the foundations of intuitive eating principles. You can email me or just click the link in the show notes. And now back to the episode.
Well, it would be, I would imagine, with someone I'm working with, to try and bring their attention back from the weight gain into like what's driving this binge eating. What's really going on here? The weight gain is just a byproduct of your behavior around food and your biology. It's as simple as that when it comes to what weight gain is. It's not a behavior in and of itself. It's so derailing for people to focus on weight because you're focusing on an outcome, which then just totally messes up the process. So it would be the same in this situation, I would think. If someone's weight was going up and they're in chaos with their food, we need to deal with the chaos. I need to acknowledge the distress around the weight gain. That's not to try and say to someone, oh, just don't worry about the weight gain. It's not as simple as that. I think that quite often people are hoping, I certainly was hoping, to get to a place where I was just comfortable with my weight and I could accept it 100% of the time, and I never thought about it. I've since shifted that to it's more about managing the part of me that's always going to feel dissatisfied with that part. And how do I live a life, even though my body might not be where I would choose for it to be? How do I still live? Because what happens when you're in the disordered eating and the chaos is your brain goes, no, we're not going to live like this. This is unacceptable. We have to go back to this focusing on the weight gain thing, and you stay stuck. But I think if you can figure out your weight is what it is today, that is a fact. That is an indisputable fact that your weight is not going to change barely over the course of a day. So then what do you do with that information? If it's out of your control, what are you going to do? You're going to rally against that? It doesn't mean that it's not going to be painful even, and there's not going to be some distress, but it's what do we decide? That idea, like what do we have control of? We have control of what do we want our attitude to that to be.
This is really resonating because, and I remember this like yesterday, the potential for circular thinking to keep happening. Whereas like, I don't want to accept the weight gain because it means this. And it's like you get caught in this loop and you can't get out to the place you're talking about of getting to, where it's like, well, how do I see this as the reality and then live a life in alignment outside of that? It's like you just sit and you spin in this circle. I'm working with a client right now who is stuck in this circle. I mean, it's so interesting to listen sometimes to my clients because I'm like, oh my gosh, I had those exact same thoughts at this certain point in my life. And what she's experiencing is feeling the resistance against gaining the weight because there's a belief that if she accepts the weight gain, it's like accepting a lack of autonomy and a lack of say-so in her own life based on a history that she has with her family of being overlooked and her opinions not mattering. So she has converted these emotions, as far as I've deciphered, to, okay, well, my opinions and preferences and my autonomy is going to be rooted now into my body. And if my body is not listening to me, if my body is not hearing what I would like, then accepting it means that I am laying down and succumbing again, or that I'm being overruled again. And that tie of like these parallels of like life experiences where we really can channel something towards, I mean, I used to channel a lot of things that I couldn't navigate in the real world to my body. And I projected it there. And then you get stuck. You're going to stay stuck in this circle because it's not really about your body. It's about feeling heard and seen and validated. And if you're looking at something over here and you're like, I can't accept this because I can't accept this over here. I can't accept the fact that my family did not consider me. You're not going to accept that your family didn't consider you. You're not saying that's okay. But because we're translating this to your body, it's like it's like literally you can't get past it because it's not really about the body. And so I think so much of body image work is separating out what you've projected onto your body and what it means for you to accept weight gain, and seeing that as a distinct thing from what you're really trying to accept or what you're really trying to say for yourself or how you're trying to stand up for yourself. I mean, there's a whole list of things that could be going on. Our body is such a breeding ground for all of these emotions and experiences we've had in our lives, and we can project so much onto it. But if you can see them separately and you can start of being like, oh, this is a different thing, then I think that's the only way to step out of the circular thinking, because you're no longer fighting something that's actually over here that you're not really getting at by addressing it through your body.
I agree that meaning is really important. I'll often say, so if you're gaining weight and you're distressed about that, what are you making it mean that you're gaining weight? Because there's a whole story around that, and it's the story that makes it incredibly painful. So I think it's helpful for us to know our stories, encouraging people to just have a think about what that really means. Another place where I think people get stuck with acceptance is they think that they're accepting something forever. You know, this idea that We're just talking about accepting what you can't control, which is the here and now. Whatever your body is today is beyond your control. It doesn't mean you're accepting that your body's always going to be this. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I also think acceptance is a practice. I mean, I don't know about you, Steph, but I've had to accept over and over again, and I've had to let go over and over again. And I keep having to do that. It's not something that I've just done and the work is finished and I'm complete. And now I'm in this great place of peace all the time.
No, that's true. I'm thinking about like my own story here now. I'm thinking about like what was the meaning for me of gaining weight and how that can really show up and how untangling that is still truly a process, because I think that once we do learn to project what weight gain means, once we identify this for ourselves, it's like you have to keep revisiting it, because even I still will notice, that I'm projecting that story sometimes onto my body. And then just in the act of remembering that that's a story that I've linked up, I can then separate it, and then I can work on the acceptance again, because it's kind of like, okay, let me recalibrate. But what about for, we talked about the one side of the spectrum, but what about for people who are looking to cope with weight gain that might be not a reflection of anything out of control anymore? That's truly someone who's made peace with food and is now finding that their body is approaching its natural resting place, and not that's is approaching its natural set point. And that reality setting in of this is where my body seems to want to be. And not that it will look exactly this way forever, but that this is my weight range. And it's a coming to terms with that and coping with that idea as something different from what we just talked about.
Well, I think that's me. I think that's kind of where I'm at. And it's really about just accepting where I am now. There's a part of me that's always going to hope. I don't know if it's always going to hope. That's some fortune telling thinking there. There's a part of me that hopes that one day somehow I will be lighter than I am now, because I do have some aches and pains that I think might be exacerbated by my weight. There's some of the stuff I've talked about around just accepting the here and now, like how my body is today. Ultimately, where I am now is beyond my control. It's completely beyond my control in this moment. It's really painful to resist that. And that's why I continue to let go, is because I don't want that pain. I don't need that pain. I also think something that happens with people when they're not happy with their weight is they'll say to themselves, if I lose weight, then I'm going to be killing it at life. I'm going to do all these things that I haven't done before. I'm going to have so much more confidence. I'm going to go on holiday. I'm going to date. I'm going to wear these clothes. I'm going to do all these kinds of things. So they put aspects of life on hold, because until I lose the weight, I'm not going to do that. And I sometimes think it's the other way around. This idea that actually you can't wait to lose the weight in order to live. I think sometimes you have to live first. And then when you're engaged in life and other things become more important and take up more of your time, then maybe your weight will change as a result of that. And there's values that come into this as well. Like, what do I want my values to be? I don't want my values to be around not doing things because I feel uncomfortable. Like, I did a yoga retreat over the summer, and I was the largest person on the yoga retreat. And I clocked it straight away. Like, my mind just did that thing where it does that. And I felt the kind of the discomfort of that. And there might have been a time where I would say, I can't go and do something like that until, I knew that there was a chance I was going to be the biggest person on the yoga retreat. And it turned out that that was true. But it's almost like when you do something, it's sometimes helpful, I think, to go, well, what's the worst that could happen? The worst that could happen at that moment, me going on a yoga retreat, is I'm the biggest person. Why? What do I make that mean? What do I make it mean I'm the biggest person on the yoga retreat? And it kind of falls away a bit there, because then I see that the story just isn't true. Like all these things that I'm imagining. And I don't even know, because sometimes I'm like, I don't even know what I make that mean. I just somehow make it mean that, like, I don't know. What do I make it mean? Yeah, it's bad. Like, no clearer than that.
Yeah.
Someone's going to be the biggest person on the yoga retreat. Why shouldn't it be me? That's the humility that comes back.
This is the humility, because I think when I'm hearing you say that, I'm thinking to myself, well, first of all, I'm trying to put myself in that position, but I'm also imagining, what something I hear a lot from people is, well, I know that other people will be judging me too. And it's like the escaping that. And then it's a question of, well, this is the value system thing again, because it's like I've certainly been the biggest person in a room or in a group or whatever. And yes, there's this idea it's just bad. It's just you're not supposed to be. And other people will be judging that too. And you know that other people are also assessing that and being like, well, I'm not as bad as her, and like you don't want to be that person. And honestly, like I can certainly get sucked into, I've been there where you get sucked into that story. But there's a voice in me now that I did not have access to before that like is rising even as we speak. That it's like I don't know, if you're used to listening to that voice, you become so small. It starts to really make your head hang low. There's a shame that comes in. You're like, yeah, and you sort of walk away with your tail between your legs, like that you're this person that's the biggest in the room. And there's another voice in my head that's kind of like, you know what? Like if other people are judging that, like I'm sorry for them. Like that's kind of on them. And I choose not to live with that whole thing. Like that is an old record player to me that never got me anywhere to believe in that and to really like feed into that story that it's bad to be the biggest one. And there's just more empowerment to turn the volume up on here and saying like I'm here, I'm doing yoga, I'm meeting new people. My body size and the relation of my body size to anyone else's body size is of such little importance really, unless you're talking about having a value system of body size, which I no longer subscribe to. And if someone else does, I'm sure they're working on some things. Like my value system, however, is showing up, clearing my mind, being present with myself, and showing up for myself, right? Like that's where my values are now. So I am going to choose to stop going back into that mental track of my body size, my body size. I'm the biggest one in the room and somehow now I have less power or I'm lower on the totem pole than everyone else because that used to be a value system of mine. I wanted to be the most powerful, the most whatever. Not powerful, but the most, the higher up. Now it's like, no, why? For what? What does that ever get you? That just feeds an ego that ultimately doesn't leave you feeling very good and it's not real. There's nothing underneath that. I would much rather be seen for my energy now. I would much rather be seen for how someone feels around me. That's my value system now. So I choose on purpose when this old value system comes up to remind myself that that's no longer applicable and that I have a whole nother option on the table of looking at this differently. And I don't have to do that thing anymore where I'm like, I'm the biggest. And it happens. Like you go there and then you give yourself permission to turn the volume down on that and turn it up on something else. And that's the part that I've cultivated for a long time and I practice doing, but I know it now. It's another record player that I have. I just have to remember to turn it on. And when I can, all of a sudden, I'm so much lighter because it's like, oh yeah, I don't have to do that. I don't have to sit here like wishing it for a different reality. I can just choose to focus on a different, truer reality. That's an option. I think that we don't give ourselves this option.
Mm-hmm. And I had such a good time. The people were absolutely great. And another thought that I had, and I have this sometimes, and I've never actually said this to anyone, so it's probably might even sound a bit strange, but I sort of think to myself that, okay, if I go somewhere and I'm the biggest person in the group, then maybe I'm making someone else feel more comfortable who was worried about being the biggest person in the group. Maybe I can take that role because I can be more comfortable in that role than somebody else can from the work that I've done. And I'm kind of okay with taking that role.
Yeah, because it's assuming that that role is bad also.
Hmm.
And I think that again, that's something we're bred to believe. And I think when you do work on fat phobia and just recognizing how we assume that role is bad, that's a value system reflection. And we can say, oh, I've changed the way, even if everyone else is thinking like that. I don't believe that. What's wrong with being bigger? Am I sitting here contemplating everybody's hair color? And if someone's hair color is the darkest in the room, like maybe I'm just going to take the lens off of that altogether because I don't want to subscribe to that anymore. And if I sit here thinking about it, I'm subscribing to it. Things happen, we have thoughts. But where we choose to keep our attention can be a choice sometimes. And to move it away from even assigning that role as a bad thing. Why would it be? It doesn't have to be.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. And something that's always helped me, I don't even know if I heard it somewhere, if it was something I realized myself. I get that a lot. I have things that have helped me, and I don't know if it came from me or somewhere
Can't
else.
credit them.
I
I know.
know. But it's
Somebody.
it's that idea that people tend to like people based on how you make them feel. It's
Mm.
as simple as that. We assume that if you know, look the ideal way and you come across as really strong, like you've got it all together, that people will like that. And actually, what I found is people don't like that because it just triggers everybody else's
Yeah.
insecurities. So I think there's this whole thing, like you say, this value system tied up that somehow we're more worthy if we're closer to the society's ideal and that people will like us more. I just think is so incorrect on the individual level.
I agree. I also think I'm thinking now, like some people would say, I don't want to necessarily even be liked. I want to be on top. I hear
Hmm.
that so much, like that this is something. But when you point it out to someone and you say, is your value system about your experience of life and how others experience you, or is your value system about being on top? When you point it out, when someone hears that out loud, they're like, "Oh gosh, it's about being on top." And then they're like, "Oh, that's awful. Why am I like this?" And then there's a whole exploration to do there. I dedicate a lot of client sessions to that, to untangling that. But I think knowing it and having the awareness that that's what you're doing, because that doesn't feel good. How you feel, how you make others feel, having people want to be around you, that feels good. It's so humanly fulfilling versus being on top. That's another human. I mean, I think it is another human instinct because of the way we've evolved, and being on top meant you had access to and you had more privileges and you survived. So I think that it comes from something real, but it no longer pertains in this world. And I think it's an emptiness that we're left with. But as far, I also want to just mention when we were talking about coping with this and getting to the place of coping with weight gain, that is just maybe your natural point. I think that there's identity work there too. I think that we can move through life assuming that our thinnest self is the self we're aiming for, and that that's our great identity. Like that is our grand plan to get there and be this person that has everything together, and being thin is part of that. And for me anyway, when I realized that this was the body that I'm going to be living in right now, and I can still do all these other things and live this life that, and and show up in this body, that I had to do an identity recapitulation, kind of like, okay, so the picture I had in my mind of what I was to be isn't isn't. It's not. It's a different picture, and that's disorienting. I had to do a lot of work around seeing my body in this shape and saying, I am that person, and it looks different than what I thought, but this is it. This is my identity. And I had to get comfortable, and it wasn't easy. Like looking in the mirror every time, it was like a different picture than what I thought I was. But over time and over like exposure therapy really on that, and reassigning what my identity was and what it meant to have, people feel good around me and to achieve goals, or whatever it is that I wanted out of life, which by the way, it never looks like that picture anyway. But seeing those things in conjunction with this body and reassigning it and just like reformatting this was a way that I coped with my weight gain, because I don't think I could have done it. I don't think I would have been able to cope if I'd ignored the fact that my identity picture needed to shift, and
Mhm.
really, really working hard to see myself in a role that I only thought was accessible to me in a thin body.
Mhm. There's so much stuff popping off in my brain now around identity because I grew up thin and I was thin into my early 20s, naturally thin, didn't really worry or think about food or weight in that aspect. And I can remember when my binge eating started and I gained weight. I can remember a friend of mine had introduced me to some mutual friends, and she told me the next day how afterwards they said how nice I was. And I realized no one had ever called me nice. And which makes it sound like I must have been this awful person.
I
And
doubt it.
I've gone back to my friends around this. I was like, was I? And they're like, no. And people say that a lot about me now. There's something, I used to always get the feedback that I was intimidating. And I wasn't trying to be intimidating when I was thin, but there's a lot of projections that would come my way. And I was quite identified with that because I was used to people like commenting on it, you know, in that sort of envious way. And also my friendship groups changed a lot, like teenage and early 20s. I had a lot of male friends. I mean, I was a police officer as well. So like a lot of my colleagues were male. And then when my disordered eating changed, my friends became female. I didn't have as many female friends before. So there was such a shift in identity. And so when we think of values and we think of who we want to be and how we want to show up in the world, like when I die, I want people to talk about how kind I was and how compassionate I was and what a lovely person I was. I don't want people to say, oh, she had this amazing figure. Who cares? Like it's rotting in the ground at that point.
Just to bring it really home.
Yeah, keeping it real.
That's how you cope, everybody.
Oh dear. We should probably look at trying to wrap it up, just thinking time-wise. How we want to do that. We'll just leave it rotting in the ground, shall we?
Rotting in the grave.
On that note.
Yeah, I'm sure we could go on here. Honestly, we could make this a 3-parter, but I hope that gives everybody something to take with them, at least for today.
Yeah, we're always interested in what you think. You can contact the show via email address lifeafterdietspodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with us on Instagram @lifeafterdietspodcast. So thank you for joining us, everyone. Thank you for joining me, Steph.
We'll see you next week, Sarah.
See you next week.